I was trying to settle down to write these words in mid-May of this year as Israel was once again conducting an air war and what seemed about to become a ground war as well against Palestinian communities, causing significant casualties. I was trying to write these words the morning after 200 people perished in collapsed apartment buildings in Gaza. Of the $3.8 billion that the U.S. gives to Israel each year, $3.3 billion go to the Israeli Defense Forces. Israel also purchases aircraft and weaponry from U.S.-based industries. My nation, my tax dollars, support the occupation of Palestine under genocidal apartheid conditions. This has been on my mind as I've been writing. I need this to stay on my mind so that I can make the connections that elucidate so-called conflicts that are presented by corporate media as endless or primordial, rather than wars conducted by my country and its allies in the service of empire. I'm recording these words in Northern California in late May for a virtual discussion in September for an event sponsored by Columbia University in New York City on the 20th anniversary of the advent of the so-called War on Terror. These spatial and temporal connections and disruptions preoccupy me as well. What do I want to say in May 2021 concerning a 20-year span of time in relation to a global war for an event that will take place in September? A virulent pandemic has robbed so many people around the world of their lives or their loved ones or their jobs or homes or peace of mind. Authoritarian oligarchies are resurgent. As my mind surveys a litany of horrors, catastrophes, and violent incidents, I feel tempted to simply scream, "Enough," and tear my hair and curl up into a ball or make a fist. But I'm here to write, to speak to others, and to learn. Back in early October 2001, in a similar mood, I joined some of my friends and colleagues to set down our objections to the retributive bombing of sites of Afghanistan. We feared then, and our fears were confirmed, that the air war would inaugurate a full-scale invasion by the U.S. and its allies. As the bombing began on October 7th, with strikes in Kabul and Jalalabad, the Bush administration asserted that targets were limited to Taliban military sites and so-called terrorist training grounds. However, in order to take control of the major Afghan cities and airports, and to make it possible to move ground troops into the country, heavy air power exacted considerable damage to the built environment and vital infrastructures, and there were considerable civilian casualties. According to a Cost of War project report, over the 20 years since the start of the invasion, approximately 240,000 people have been killed in the Afghanistan and Pakistan war zone, and more than 71,000 of those killed have been civilians. In addition, many Afghans experience ill health and war wounds without easy access to hospitals or clinics due to unsafe roads or attacks on the facilities. The report concludes that the U.S. invasion has exacerbated the effects of poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to health care, and environmental degradation of Afghans' health. In the case of Iraq, the Cost of War NGO estimates that between the U.S. invasion there in 2003 and 2018, over 182,000 civilians have died from the direct war-related violence caused by the U.S., its allies, the Iraqi military and police, and opposition forces. These deaths have occurred through aerial bombing, shelling, gunshots, suicide attacks, and fires started by bombing. All of these figures are deemed to be extremely low estimates, and the actual number of casualties are thought to be much higher, even double the numbers I state here. The Cost of War report on Iraq concludes that civilians are still dying in significant numbers. When we consider the effect of these invasions, we also have to figure in the destabilizing of other countries nearby and the massive increase in the number of refugees now rendered stateless, living in deplorable and uncertain conditions. Back in October 2001, our group, which included Paolo Bacchetta, Tina Kemp, Inderpal Grewal, Mino Moilem, Jennifer Terry, and myself, drafted a statement titled Transnational Feminist Practices Against War. We made several main points. First, we called for an analysis of the gendered and racialized effects of nationalism and for a critique of patriotism. Secondly, we argued that the concept of war must be broadened to include global histories of displacement and legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism. Third, we linked domestic civil repression to warfare. We predicted that the current conflict would reverberate in the U.S. and its border zones through border patrolling and policing, as well as in the use of military and defense technologies to further subordinate poor, non-white communities. We refer to this phenomenon as the domestication of wartime violence with pernicious gendered and race effects. Fourthly and fifthly, we called for an analysis of the racist and ethnocentrist stereotypes and tropes mobilized by the press and official discourse that sustain unequal power relations. We pointed out that the U.S. casualties of the attacks of September 11 were highly personalized in news reporting, while the casualties of the U.S. retributive bombing campaign in Afghanistan were essentially rendered invisible, unknowable, unable to be acknowledged or comprehended by most North Americans. Our last point argued for a deeper understanding of the nature of capitalism and globalization as they generate transnational movements of all kinds. Here we sought to differentiate both Western and non-Western oppressive transnational movements from alternative movements that counter war and the continued production of global inequalities. We close by urging feminists to refuse the call to war in our name, a reference to the Bush administration's efforts to frame the invasion in part as an effort to free Afghan women from patriarchal Muslim fundamentalism. For most of the past 20 years, since we wrote this statement, I've worked in higher ed in public universities in California, and it never ceases to amaze me that the wars that have exacted such tremendous costs in blood and treasure, as the saying goes, are of such little immediate interest to most of my students and, frankly, to most of my colleagues. The geographies of the war zones, the extent of casualties and destruction, the extraordinary budget of the U.S. Department of Defense, greater than the combined military budgets of all other industrialized nations, that drains and depletes revenues for all manner of social welfare, including public education, the flow of military personnel back into the supposedly civilian sectors of municipal and prison policing and border control, the flow of military surplus, including tanks and assault weapons, into municipal police forces, the uptick in domestic violence and suicides linked to military veterans, the environmental catastrophe of military burn pits and oil spills that lead to lung disorders in humans and harm to innumerable species. All of these issues and much more should be of paramount importance in our curricula and research programs, as well as the subject of public forums. It's an uphill battle, and as Catherine Lutz has argued, it leaves students dangerously unprepared to recognize the irrationalities and hidden purposes behind the glittering face of power and its moral claims. I think this is a key point. Taking an anti-war position is not simply moral grandstanding. Viewing U.S. history through the lens of empire shifts the narrative from one of patriotic identity politics to a more complex field of power relations generated by a specific economic system, capitalism. That economic system, more often than not, required violent means to maintain its primary functions. For example, the settlers of the North American continent waged relentless war on indigenous inhabitants to gain control of the land. In my own state of California, the Indian population was decimated between the years of 1846 and 1873, plunging, as historian Benjamin Madley puts it, from the approximately 150,000 people that had already survived the genocidal efforts of the Spanish missions to 30,000. I live in Davis, a university town on the edge of the great vast Central Valley of California. The town of Davis occupies the traditional unceded land of the Patwin Southern Winton people. The gold rush that flooded this area with settlers made possible the legal confiscation of Patwin land, but it also spurred official and unofficial raids, lynchings, and massacres of indigenous people. The resistance and resilience of indigenous people in the face of centuries of this kind of genocidal land theft is all the more remarkable in light of the emergent transnational political and social movements that connect the water protectors of Standing Rock in the US to the Idle No More environmental movement in Canada, to Black Lives Matter organizing, to protests over income inequality in Colombia. All of these movements and many others recognize the violence work of the state as lethal to people of color, to working people, to the earth itself. As Nick Estes and Zakar Dillon argue, those fighting for justice and freedom against the endemic violence of the settler state, past, present, and future, must join forces while being attentive to the specificities of distinctive struggles. This is not always easy work. As Bernice Johnson Reagan famously put it, you don't go into coalition just because you like it. The only reason you would consider trying to team up with someone who could possibly kill you is because that's the only way you can figure that you can stay alive. But these progressive transnational movements demonstrate to us that new connections can generate new historical perspectives as well as imagined futures. When we risk working together instead of waging war, radical decolonial possibilities emerge. I want to wrap up my comments by stressing that these decolonial possibilities also require an unlearning or relearning for, as Viet Thanh Nguyen puts it, the entire body politic. Nguyen reminds us that war is never just a story about soldiers, but is in fact structuring of all of our everyday lives. Thus, as he points out, a true war story might not just focus on blood and guts or heroism, but the fact that our refrigerators might use a refrigerant made by Dow Chemical, the company that manufactured Agent Orange. As he writes, the quotidian reminds us that war's obscenity lies not only in broken bodies, but also in the complicity of its citizenry. Under what might be called compulsory militarism, even those who oppose war still end up paying its costs. For while everyone can intellectually understand that war is hell, few can resist owning a refrigerator. This is our challenge as we near the 20th anniversary of the War on Terror. It's one thing to recognize the horror of official warfare. It's another to face the horror of the vast infrastructure of militarism and its history of entanglement with settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism. So when we demand an end to U.S. financing of 40% of the Israeli military, we are connecting the dots, if you will. We're demanding that the history of U.S. geopolitics and alliances between governments and industries are linked to violence that is waged on multiple levels across geographies. The emergent progressive transnational coalitions give me lots of grounds for hope. But how much longer can Gaza wait? Thank you.